city.
Sing. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Spirit. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and filled with all things, treasury of mercy, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls. I wanted to continue where we left off last week, clarifying some of the things that I said for our benefit. And one of the things I wanted to clarify right off the bat too, and this is sort of common in the literature, if you will, any of our catecheses, and emphasis on what it means for the human person to be created in the image and likeness of God, is that any tendency to establish the image of God in the realm of rationality, of language, of freedom, has a real humanistic problem. And more than a humanistic problem, a divine problem, because it denies the status of the image to those who are on the margins of life. And this is not just theoretically a problem, this is actually a problem. If we say that to be the image and likeness of God, you must have rationality, well, or that rationality is where that image is located within you, then what happens if you do not have rationality? What happens if your brain doesn't work? We were talking about that a little bit last week, but this is in a little bit of a different frame of mind. What about the mentally disabled? Are they somehow bereft of the image of God if the image of God is located in rationality? What about those who do not have language and who cannot speak? Are they bereft of the image of God if they're not able to develop words? Okay. What about those who are incapable of caring for themselves or lack freedom to choose for themselves what they want to do? Are they not in the image of God? And this is why we have to locate the image of God in areas that are not those things. We need to remember that, again, this is not just theoretical. There was a time in this country in the early 1900s where the American government established the program of sterilizing people that were considered to be unworthy of reproduction. It's called eugenics. And this is the basis of this. If you do not have full rationality, as the Enlightenment determined what full rationality is, then your freedom should be taken away from you. So here we are in the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we did this. We said to people, you are not worthy of being considered fully in the image of God because you lack something. Because you lack something. So we've got to be very careful, and we've been doing that in this course, but I just wanted to draw that connection of trying to locate the image of God in a much deeper place, which is really where we are in our discussion here. It's a much deeper place. And the other thing, even consciousness and communication, consciousness and communication are increasingly understood now as a continuum. Trees speak to each other. They have this incredible chemical network. It's almost entirely underground, where their roots interconnect, and they're able to transfer nutrients to if there's a stand of trees that are related, if you will, and one of them gets sick, the other trees can receive those signals, and they'll redirect nutrients to that tree to try to restore it to health. That's all a form of communication. So what is communication, really? What is consciousness? There's a continuum of consciousness. And to say that only humans have consciousness, it's really an Enlightenment idea that only human beings have consciousness. But something changes when we begin to see that all of creation has a purpose in God's life, in God's plan, in the telos of creation. Everything has its place, everything has its order, everything works together to move towards a common goal, which is the enthronement of God amongst his creation. So consciousness and communication, even as elements of image, are better understood as a continuum rather than simply something only human beings have that, therefore only human beings are worthy of being treated with love and respect. And even then, we don't have a very good record on that. By the way, here's a weird thing, and I don't know how, I just jotted this down in my notes. I don't know that it's in any way related. Perhaps it is, but this has been coming, but just this week, the FDA cleared lab-grown meat for human consumption. Lab-grown meat. So this is a protein, a chemically derived protein that is essentially an animal protein. It's taken from cows. You can take it from chicken as well. In other words, there's still a donor, and the donor is an animal, but they take cells from that animal, and then they grow those cells in the lab into muscle protein, which then is developed as an edible product. Is it Lenten? Probably the burning question we all want to know. Can we eat that during a fast? And honestly, I don't know. It raises a whole... This is being touted as another dimension to what does it mean to eat animal protein but not have to kill an animal. And we don't usually think, that seems like, oh, well, that's a modern, these are people that are, too worried about everything and trying to be too sensitive to the environment and that sort of thing. But actually, that's a really interesting question. What does it mean to eat meat and not have to kill an animal when we know that as we've already discussed, what was the difference between clean and unclean in terms of animals that were consumed? And it has to do with the fact that, in theory at least, the only animals that were eaten by the faithful Israelite were animals that were offered in the temple. And so the whole clean, unclean line was, what are the animals that are blessed to be offered in the temple? Okay? So the idea of eating meat and killing creatures is actually a very biblical concept. It's a very interesting concept. I don't know what it means for lab-grown meat. But it also, I guess the other connection is, as we understand more deeply the dimensions of consciousness in other animals, there's no reason why we can't develop sensitivities to that consciousness as well, particularly when we look at things like industrial food production. Industrial food production is a very ugly. We all enjoy it. We all get our inexpensive meat from Walmart. That's because of industrial food production. So we are the beneficiaries of this, at least to our pocketbooks. But it really is quite ugly if we start to understand the sacredness of creation and the purpose and place of all things within creation. It's really hard to drive. If you've ever been out to Amarillo, Texas, I had to drive through Amarillo many times. You smell it long before you see it. You go through the cattle yards, and you see firsthand how those cattle live, and it's ugly. It's ugly, you know. The idea of being able to eat meat without having to kill creatures is an interesting one. Who knows where that'll go? But that's an aside. Any questions so far? Everyone good? Okay. So I'm going to do some notes. This is one of the books that I've been mentioning, The Religion of the Apostles by Father Stephen DeYoung, which is really a fascinating and multi-layered book. Again, I've said at times, much of it, it's not clear exactly what to do with it, because he just throws lots of information down about what the first century really was like and what things meant within the context of the first century without drawing a lot of conclusions. But on this particular area, we're drawing some things from his book into some of the conclusions that we have been talking about. For instance, the narrative of creation, he says, is the story of God. Think about this the next time you read Genesis, because this really changes things. The narrative of creation is the story of God creating a sacred space in which to dwell with his creation, which is summed up in total in the human person. That is the narrative of creation. Okay, so that confirms what we've been saying, that the narrative of creation, as we've been reading it, is not a story of naturalism. This isn't a David Attenborough, narrated nature program. It's the story of sacred space, and it's a story of God and man, creation and creator, meeting each other. That's what the story of creation is. We have to read underneath the layers of the text to be able to see that and to realize what the concern of the text is. God doesn't need this space, but humans, being created and physical, do. And likewise, God doesn't need worship and praise. Worship is the correct orientation for the human to fulfill his identity as image and likeness. This is really, really important. I've heard, people have asked this question: what kind of God do you have that needs to be worshipped? Why does your God want to hear how great he is all the time? Why do you have to say things like, praise you, O Lord? And does he have a fragile ego and he needs to be reminded by his minions how great he is? Worship is not something God needs. Worship is something we need. That's another thing that can really change your life. Worship is what we need in order to be human. Without worship and without prayer, we're really just highly conscious animals. It's worship and prayer from the image and likeness to God himself. That's what we need, because it's the connector. Worship and prayer are what connects us to God, right? They're a uniting factor. They're an element, a dimension of communication and connection. So without worship and prayer, we are not fully human. Again, the beauty of that is that nothing can be denied the power of worship and prayer. There's no mental disability that renders you incapable of worshiping God, because worship doesn't reside in the brain. Worship resides in the heart. Worship is a noetic reality, and we're going to talk about that hopefully soon. What does it mean? What is a noetic reality? What's that weird word? And how does it function? But it's in a sense the real part of ourself that prays. We think of ourselves praying with our mind as we think of words, or with our voice as we articulate or sing or say things. But really, true prayer comes from a much deeper place. It comes from the very ground of our being, which is what the fathers really describe as the heart, with a capital H, the heart, the center part of ourselves. It's I don't want to go into it right now, but it's the part of us that connects to God, and it's worship and prayer that do that. We need worship in order to be human. Next thing, throughout the ancient world, across languages and cultures, and we talked about this last year, so this is going to be a little bit of review for some of you, but gods were understood, all gods, whether it's the God of Israel or, well, not really the God of Israel, but all other gods, what we normally call the pagan gods, were understood to live either in a garden or on a mountaintop, or sometimes both, which is what we see with the God of Israel and paradise. Gods live in a garden or on a mountaintop. In Genesis, this space is described precisely as what? A garden of paradise. But a garden is not merely, as we would think of it, a garden where you just walk around, there's tomatoes growing over here, and there's cucumbers are looking good this year. And, it's not that kind of garden. In the ancient world, a garden was a place of cultivation and civilization. That's, again, there's a sort of code word. Read underneath what these words are actually indicating in their context. A garden is a place of cultivation and civilization where the human person has taken the elements, the raw chaos of creation itself, and brought it into order, brought it into beauty. And order, beauty, civilization, those things are all interlinked. They're all interconnected. As we saw last year, St. Ephrem the Syrian, in his book, Hymns on Paradise, takes this even a step further by emphasizing that paradise is a garden which is on a mountain. And this is a very deep, ancient Semitic view of the nature of paradise. So a garden is a cultivated place of meeting and worship. It's that sacred space that God creates to meet his creation, and that's why he puts the human person there. So last week we were talking about this, and we were talking about this element of the statue, and the statue as idolatry, okay? And just brief recap, most ancient people, when they were worshiping statues, they were not worshiping necessarily the material stuff that the statue was made of. The statue was an adornment of creation, but the final act of any temple in the ancient world was to enthrone the image of the god whom they wished to worship. The god they wished to worship was not the statue itself, but a spirit. All right? In our understanding, they were worshiping fallen angels. They were worshiping fallen spirits. So the final act of the creation of any temple, and here we're talking about not the Jewish temple here, but the general pagan temple of the ancient world, was the enthronement or installation of the god's image or idol, a statue whose nostrils were opened so that the spirit being worshipped could enter therein. So, in other words, part of the act of worship was to give your God a body. You need to give your God a body, something to dwell in. It is, in a sense, a possession. The God breathes into the nostrils of the idol so that that God can inhabit, and so that that God can receive worship. And remember that this is an essential element of the fall of the angels. We've already talked about this, but it's right there in Satan's temptation of Christ in the desert, where in the second temptation he says, "Worship me, and I will give you all these things." The fallen angels, what they really wanted was to be worshipped. And it had to do with them looking at the human body and realizing what God was doing with it. And that's the amazing thing. So the whole idea of having this statue and having this nostrils open and the idea of their God breathing itself into that statue was all a way of interacting with spiritual powers. That's what they were trying to do. And they were providing them with a body. They were giving them clothing. They would actually clothe the statue. They would feed and clean the statue, all as a way of having this interaction where they could get the God to do what they wanted him to do. This is really the instinct of fallen worship. I give you all these things so that you give me what I want, right? If I fail to do these things, my crops fail. Disease comes in. A tribe invades and throws down our village, whatever. This whole idea that the order of the world, the order of your world, depended on making sure that you worshiped God correctly. But the problem, of course, in pagan worship is they were worshiping the wrong gods. They were ascribing to these fallen gods, these fallen angels, the power to keep order within their lives. But that's not what fallen angels do. That's what the God of Israel does. This is the whole story of creation. It's the God of Israel who establishes order, beauty, civilization, cultivation, so that he can meet his creation in this intimate act of relationship. The gods with a lower G, the fallen angels that would inhabit these idols, they were gods of chaos. They were gods of confusion. They're gods of mischief. They're gods of darkness. So this whole idea of trying to appease them so that you got them to do what you wanted was tragic, to say the least. And it led people, human beings, to do horrible, horrible things. But that was the instinct. When we look at what people were doing and why they were doing it, that was the instinct. And let me read real quickly a passage that's not usually interpreted the way that I'm going to interpret it. So if you want to look this up later and come at me, let's have at it. This is Romans 1:18. And I just want to read this section and then describe how it's usually interpreted, but in its context, why I think it needs to be interpreted with a slightly different twist. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of men who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds or animals or reptiles. So I could read, there's a lot to talk about in that whole section, but let's talk about this for a second. That last section, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds or animals or reptiles. What are those four things? Mortal men, birds, animals, or reptiles. Those are your statues right there. Those are the statues that they're building to take on other spirits, not spirits who are truly immortal and divine like God, the God of Israel, but fallen spirits. And one of the things that's interesting, another thing we talked about last year was Göbekli Tepe, and many of the ancient temple sites that have been found, particularly in Turkey today, but ancient Mesopotamia. And one of the things we precisely see, and it just really jumps out in your brain when you read these texts, are that these are temples built in like 11,000 BC. And what do they have on them? But images of birds and reptiles and animals, and sometimes humans as well. So, that's what they were worshiping. But what St. Paul is saying to them is they should know better. Why should they know better? This is where this passage gets interesting. God has made it clear, ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, his eternal power and deity have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Now, that line indicates something what we call in theology general revelation. By going out into the woods or going out into the mountains, we have this sort of sense of the Spirit and we have a general sense that the world is created, a general sense that there are things to the order of that creation that can be known. And it's usually contrasted or coupled with specific revelation. Specific revelation is something like Scripture, all right? The Word of God coming to a prophet. That's very specific revelation in which God directly reveals his will or who he is. General revelation, though, is available to everybody. And this passage has usually been described as St. Paul saying, just by living in the world, you have a general sense of God's eternal power and deity. I'm not so sure, though, that that's exactly what St. Paul has in mind, precisely because he goes right to idolatry. He goes right to idolatry. And I think there's something there where, because of the way that ancient worship worked, and because St. Paul is talking into a world where everybody worshiped in a specific place, I think he's talking a little bit more about worship than just about general revelation and the idea that nature sort of reveals the beauty of God and makes us feel sort of warm and fuzzy. That, again, that transcendentalist tendency to think of nature as this wonderful, peaceful place. Not all human beings have thought that about nature. But I think that what's really going on here is that he's saying that to all human cultures, what has been available to them is the realization of who they should worship, but it's not who they do worship. That's what really St. Paul is saying. They should worship the one who is the God and creator of all things. They are actually, though, being darkened in their minds, worshiping the creature and not the creator. This is liturgical language. This is the language of who is your temple made for? Who is the image that you worship in the middle of your temple? Okay, so slightly different. That's kind of an aside, but it's certainly related to everything that we're talking about here. So here's the point. The image of the God is the place where it encounters the human world. The image of the God, and here again we're talking about pagan statues, the image of the God is the place where it encounters the human world. It's a created, a physical thing, the spirit enters it, and then the people come and have food and clothe it and clean it. And there's a wonderful story called Bel and the Dragon in the Apocrypha. Anyone read Bel and the Dragon? Where this whole idea of feeding a statue is made fun of. There's a temple and there's a statue, and every evening the priests pile all this food, the offerings of the people, then they lock the doors, and then when they open the doors in the morning, ta-da, all the food is gone. What has happened? The statue has consumed all the food in the temple, and this is seen as a sign that the statue is worthy of being worshipped. Well, is it Daniel in Bel and the Dragon? I think Bel and the Dragon is one of the Daniel stories, right? I'm sorry, Septuagint. Yeah. Well, that's a terminology thing. Yeah, it's in our Bible. Let's put it that way. It's in our Old Testament Bible. The way that the Protestants and the Roman Catholics call the Apocrypha, which are part of the Greek Bible, Bel and the Dragon. So thank you for that. What happens is the prophet of God says, I'm going to prove that this is wrong. And so he goes into the temple and he spreads flour all over the floor. And then they bring the food in and they close it. And then they open the doors in the next morning and all the food is gone. But they notice that there's footprints in all the flour. So they trace the footprints, and there's a secret passageway underneath the temple where the priests are sneaking in at night with their wives. They're eating all the food. And then they're going back out, and then they're claiming to the people, you see how wonderful your God is, you know? This is a general suspicion of the priesthood. You create gods for us to worship and bring all our gifts to, and then you enjoy the fruit of all those gifts secretly. There was just that passageway found under the pyramid. Was it Cleopatra's tomb, or whose tomb were they excavating recently, and they found this absolutely incredible passageway deep underneath the pyramid that's still intact. It's the same idea, though. You have passageways to go in and do things. So that's an example of this sort of thing working in the ancient world. But again, let's get back to this. The image of God is the place where it encounters the human world. In Genesis, rather than the installation of an idol, God makes for himself a living image and likeness, breathes himself, his own spirit, into his nostrils, the breath of life, and enthrones him in the temple of paradise as the first high priest. So this is really the culmination of a lot of things we've been talking about, this idea of statues, of nostrils, of breathing. Remember in the story of Genesis, God creates Adam, he breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and then what does he do? He puts him in a garden. All of this would be read in the ancient world as an enthronement ceremony, but not the enthronement of a human-built statue, the enthronement of the human person. This is what made the spirits, the angels that fell, mad. This is what incited them to rebel against God. They saw that the human person was created to be the image and likeness of God, meaning the space where God dwelt and met with his creation. The human person himself, not a statue, but the body, the human body. And this is why the body is good. And this is why we'll need to talk a lot about, the assault on the human body, which is the nature of the world we live in today. Our bodies are constantly being assaulted. Now they're being assaulted by lab-grown meat. Think of that. We've been assaulted by Twinkies. We've been assaulted by junk food and all this junk that we're told will make you, will be pleasurable and happy. Now it's lab-grown meat. But obviously that's just the surface. We've been assaulted by a defiling sexual ethic. A defiling sexual ethic which seeks to distort the human body, not as the dwelling place of God, but as the realm of your private pleasure. And this is one of the most insidious assaults that exists in our world today, that the statue of God, the living, breathing statue of God, is constantly being pushed down and defiled and distorted and perverted. Why? Because that's exactly what spiritual evil wants. That's exactly what they want. They want to take down the human person, which is to be the beauty and the glory of God. That's what it means for each and every one of us to be made in the image and likeness of God. It's why we cannot deny the image and likeness of God in any human person at any stage of life. This informs our ethic about abortion. It informs our ethic about euthanasia and aging, and why it's why we can put animals down, but we cannot put human beings down. You cannot. Because if there's breath in them, they remain the image and likeness of God. That's referring to the old age. Obviously, in an infant in the womb, there is no breath. That's an interesting thing about the way some would say modern Jews and their understanding, not all modern Jews, but some Jewish takes on abortion do have to do with the breath. I don't want to get sidelines on that right now. But for us, the conception of the image is the beginning of the image, and there's no time when the conception of the image isn't the image and likeness of God, which is why abortion is simply impossible for us to countenance in any form, right? So on all spectrums of life, but especially while you're living in your body, while you're growing, while you're developing who you are and your identity, you are the image and likeness of God. God has breathed into you. This happens liturgically in your baptism when the priest breathes over you. It is an image of God himself giving you breath. When you come out of the water of baptism, you do what? You breathe. And it is now the Spirit of God that dwells within you. You are the image and likeness of God. And your body is sacred. Your body is meant to be the place where God dwells with his creation. That's why we need prayer, and that's why we need worship, and that's why we can't, again, I think it's so easy for us to fall into this idea that, well, okay, church, we have worship, and that happens. Before I go down this path, I do need to finish here. I'll just finish on this note. Church is fine, we do that on Sunday, but then real life is during the week, right? Work is real life. School is real life. Social life is real life. We just take this little piece and we give it to God, and then we say, well, why should we pray more? This week we have Vespers tonight, we have liturgy tomorrow, we have Vespers Tuesday night, we have liturgy Wednesday, we have an Activist hymn Wednesday night. Why should we do all that? Because you were made to do that. That is real life. That is where God and creation meet. It's precisely in our common worship of him. It's not he who needs it, it's we who need it. We thrive on it. We thrive on it. And we spiritually decline when we don't do it. When we set prayer and worship aside, we spiritually suffer. We're going to talk more about that. Next week, we're not going to meet because it's Thanksgiving weekend. There's no church school for the kids. There's no church school up here. But from now until Christmas, really, we're going to be unpacking a little bit more about what the image of God and the human person as the sacred space where God meets his creation, what that means for our understanding of sexuality, what it means for some of the problematic issues that our society is going through, and why they use a completely different philosophy regarding the human body to arrive where they do at what they think is freedom and liberation, but why we see it as a form of slavery, a form of distortion of the image. We'll be really carrying that all the way through until we get into our Christmas break. Any burning questions? All right, let's stop there, and we'll meet again here in 2 weeks for our next class.